British Columbia is a province of staggering contrasts, a land where the Great Bear Rainforest alone stretches larger than Switzerland, yet remains almost unknown even to those who live nearby. Behind the postcard images of Vancouver and Whistler lies a geography that rewrites the rules of survival. Fjords deeper than mountains are tall, rivers that build and erase their own deltas, and climates so extreme they mirror Spain in one valley and a rainforest in the next. How can one province hold so many worlds at once, and what hidden forces have shaped its people, economy, and survival? The answers may surprise even lifelong British Columbians. Part 1. Where mountains meet the sea. 1. Howe Sound, the southernmost true fjord. However close the skyline feels, Howe Sound is not a bay, but a fjord carved by late Pleistocene ice and then drowned by post-glacial sea rise, making it the southernmost true fjord on North America's Pacific Rim. Highway 99 traces a textbook U-shaped valley past Squamish, where glacial polish still shines on granite, and recovery since 1990's cleanup orders has brought back herring spawns, sea lions, and even returning sea otters. Industry and ecology now share one narrow corridor defined by tides and walls, a fjord that forgave. 2. Knight Inlet, a saltwater river 100 kilometers long. From that forgiven fjord, scale explodes at Knight Inlet, which carries the Pacific roughly 100 kilometers inland between cliffs that rise like gates learning to breathe. Tidal sills here translate lunar pull into standing waves at max flood, and winds running down glacier can stack chop into short, steep faces that challenge even big aluminum guide boats. Grizzlies graze sedge meadows at Glendale Cove, while Yulican runs braid ecology to tradition, a corridor where distance multiplies hazard. 3. Naquacto Rapids, among the fastest tidal currents on Earth. Distance becomes speed at Naquacto Rapids, where current through the pinch around Turret Rock has been measured above 15 knots and reputed still higher by mariners who time slack like surgeons. Old loggers literally chained the tiny islet to anchor booms against the moon's leverage, a folklore-sounding fix recorded in steel. Even modern skippers respect this throttle and wait for the brief truce, a channel that speaks in orders. By the way, every minute you've seen so far is the result of digging through maps, archives, and sources that most people never find. If you value this kind of depth, subscribing is the best way to support the time and effort it takes. 4. Skookumchuck, the daily horizontal waterfall. Orders turn into ritual at Skookumchuck Narrows, where a tide height difference can generate a roaring tide race that locals call a horizontal waterfall, and kayakers surf like a movable skate park. Spectators gather on bluffs above the Sunshine Coast to watch glassy green faces form and collapse exactly on schedule from tide tables. Shops time lunch breaks to peak hydraulics as if the Pacific kept office hours. A calendar written in waves. 5. Vancouver Island's rain shadow, dry gardens in a wet sea. Waves become wind behind Vancouver Island's spine, which blocks Pacific storms and casts a long, dry cape over the Saanich Peninsula and the Gulf Islands. Annual precipitation in places like Victoria or Satorna can fall to less than half of windward totals, allowing arbutus to curl red bark and Gary oaks to anchor meadows where Camas once fed Coast Salish communities. Real estate and agriculture follow this gradient like a hidden map. Mediterranean pockets made by mountains. 6. Okanagan Mediterranean summers, Spain hidden in the interior. From that hidden map, warmth concentrates inland in the Okanagan, where summers are officially Köppen CSB, the dry summer Mediterranean class shared with parts of Spain and coastal California. Vineyards terrace old glacial benches above Oceauyas, Naramata, and Lake Country. And strong diurnal swings help preserve acidity even in hot Julys, shaping a wine economy that converts Ice Age landforms into modern cash flow. Sagebrush and lake breeze write the valley's signature, a valley that ferments its own sun. 7. Spotted Lake, a mineral palette that paints itself. Sun turns to chemistry at Spotted Lake near Osayuyas, where fierce evaporation concentrates magnesium sulfate, calcium, and sodium until summer reveals a mosaic of bright circular ponds bordered by mineral rims. Silk's Okanagan people long recognized the site's healing significance, while early 20th century operations scraped salts for munitions, leaving a human footnote on a geochemical canvas. Each drought redraws the pattern with patient precision, a canvas refreshed by drought. 8. The Fraser River, a free-flowing giant that builds land. From that canvas, the story widens to the Fraser, one of North America's great rivers with no dam on its main stem, a political and ecological exception that preserves a full freshet. Each spring, it ships millions of tons of sediment from the interior plateau to the coast, growing the Richmond Delta lowlands that ports, farms, and suburbs occupy, only for winter storms to claw part of it back. The delta advances and retreats like a breathing frontier, a constructor that edits its own blueprint. 9. The Great Bear Rainforest, a country-sized cathedral of moss. That breathing frontier opens into the Great Bear Rainforest, about 6.4 million hectares, larger than Switzerland, where cedar colonnades hold clouds and salmon runs feed wolves, eagles, and even the forest itself through marine nutrients. Landmark agreements finalized by 2016 established ecosystem-based management that blends stewardship, guardian watchman patrols, selective logging, and community economies, from Bella Bella to Hartley Bay. Here, conservation was negotiated like infrastructure, then enforced by tide and rain. A nation-scaled forest that votes with rain. However, if water can teach stone to move and forest to eat the sea, the coast's next chapter explains how ice and fire force stone to yield, raising flat-topped volcanoes under glaciers and carving monoliths that breathe weather. A hinge where Canada's edge confesses heat. Part 2. Ice, Fire, and Stone. 10. Stawamus Chief, a granite wall that breathes weather. However quiet Squamish looks from the highway, the Stawamus Chief rises almost 700 meters from tidewater in 3 domed summits, a granitic face rivaling Yosemite's walls in presence and physics. Exfoliation sheets peel like pages where pressure once lifted during uplift, leaving talus fans that map centuries of rockfalls at the cliff's base. Climbers trace crack systems born as magma cooled, while howl sound gusts slam the wall into sudden white noise that ricochets down the valley. A mountain that times itself in falls. 11. Tuyas, volcanoes signed flat by the weight of ice. Falls give way to fire frozen mid-gesture in the far north, where tuyas rise as table-topped, steep-sided volcanoes that erupted beneath the Cordilleran ice sheet. Magma met pressurized meltwater, quenched to glass and palagononite, then capped with subaerial lava once the glacier thinned, stamping a flat signature on a cone that should have been pointed. British Columbia gave the landform its very name via the Tuya River and Tuya Butte, exporting a Canadian word into global geology. Mountain certified by ice. 12. The Garibaldi Volcanic Belt, Canada's quiet line of heat. Ice's signature continues above Vancouver's horizon, where the Garibaldi Volcanic Belt, northernmost reach of the Cascade Arc, threads Mount Garibaldi, Mount Kiley, and the Mount Meager complex. Meager's last big eruption about 2,360 years ago dumped pumice across the Lillooet Valley and left unstable hydrothermal zones that modern hazard maps still outline for landslides and lahars. Fumaroles breathe through glacier skirts, reminding a metropolis that subduction does not retire because the views are pretty. A volcano line hid in plain sight. 13. Tsayak's Cone, a lethal breath carried by memory. Sight becomes testimony in the Nass Valley, where Tsayak's Cone erupted in the late 1600s and released suffocating gases that Nisga'a oral history says killed more than 1,000 people. The basaltic flow dammed creeks, redirected a river, and left fields that rasp like a burned alphabet underfoot.
each clinker a syllable of warning. Beside the highway, a memorial ties seismology to sovereignty, placing grief and geology in the same sentence. A river once moved by loss. 14. Silver Throne Caldera, a buried circle under a blue crown. Loss turns to scale above the fjords where the high Iltsuk icefield hides the Silver Throne Caldera, a collapsed structure roughly 20 to 30 kilometers wide whose rim is stitched with younger cones. Satellite images reveal a ring half erased by neve, while fieldwork links its chemistry to the same subduction engine that powers the Garibaldi chain to the south. Crevasse shadows trace an architecture of heat most maps ignore because the snow looks timeless. A crown of fire under snow. 15. Hunland Falls, a 400-meter sermon nobody hears. Snow feeds an edge in Tweedsmuir South, where Hunland Falls drops about 401 meters in a single freefall from Turner Lake into the Atnarco system, among Canada's highest single-drop waterfalls. There is no road to the brink. Float planes stitch the last miles from Anaheim Lake, and hikers zigzag down switchbacks that tremble with mist. So the country's giant speaks mostly to bears and ravens. Spray writes rainbows for an audience that doesn't clap. A cathedral heard by few. 16. Eskers, rivers that kept running inside the ice. Few witnesses also mark the sinuous gravel ridges that lace the interior, eskers laid by subglacial rivers pressurized in tunnels while the ice sheet still covered the plateau. Their crests now stand a few meters above muskeg and spring flood, so winter roads, trap lines, and seismic lines borrow them like dry causeways gifted by a vanished engineer. Every rounded pebble remembers a river we cannot see. Old channels turned to roads. 17. Marble Canyon, turquoise where limestone interrupts the dark. Old channels end in a surprise near Lillooet, where Marble Canyon frames Pavilion and Turquoise lakes and aquamarine, a limestone window cut into a province dominated by granites and basalts. Microbiolites in nearby Pavilion Lake drew NASA analog studies for extraterrestrial life, while climbers clip bolts on pale walls that feel Mediterranean in July light. Evaporative wind etches ripples as if a warm sea briefly returned to the Fraser country. A bright interruption carved from stone. 18. Gary Oak echoes and fault line memories that unify the arc. Stone's interruptions echo back toward the coast, where Gary Oak meadows and arbutus traces appear again in rain shadow pockets, quiet reminders that microclimate can rewrite the same province in different inks. Beneath that patchwork lies a structural rhyme: the Queen Charlotte Fault to the north, the subduction of the Juan de Fuca Plate to the south, and a suitor of terrains that arrived like rafts over hundreds of millions of years. Economy, hazard, and culture stack on that tectonic ledger, whether we acknowledge it or not. Landscapes share one engine. However, facts on fire and ice only prepare the stage for forces that hide in lines and meetings, where rivers split a continent, colors refuse to mix, forests eat the sea, and earthquakes write lesson plans in beach gravel. The next chapter follows those quiet borders and the consequences they demand. A line that decides everything.
Part 3. Hidden Divides and Quiet Forces. 19. The Continental Divide, where a raindrop chooses an ocean. However invisible it appears on a sunny ridge, the Continental Divide in southeastern British Columbia sends one raindrop west toward the Fraser and the Pacific, while the next rolls north toward the Peace, Slave, Mackenzie, and the Arctic. Survey crews once set brass caps along the height of land through Kootenay and Yoho, but snowmelt still makes the final edit each spring, routing pulses through cambers of ice. On the Columbia icefield, a footstep can straddle 3 basins at once, a cartographic tightrope with real consequences for salmon, dams, and ports downstream. Lines on maps spend money, a boundary that decides quietly. 20. Lightens two-tone rivers, a meeting that refuses to mix. Quiet choices become visible at Lighton, where the clear Thompson meets the silt-heavy Fraser and the colors run side by side for kilometers like feuding flags. Grain physics explains the spectacle. The Fraser carries glacial flour whose sub-62 micron particles stay in suspension longer, while the Thompson's coarser load settles quickly into deeper threads. Engineers even hear a change in canyon acoustics above the scene, a subtle note that freight crews read like weather. In 2021, the village recorded 49.6 degrees Celsius before a fire erased streets, and the confluence kept moving anyway. Two waters, one lesson in inertia, a handshake that keeps gloves on. 21. Adams River salmon, a pulse that reddens an entire valley. Gloves come off every fourth autumn when the dominant sockeye cycle turns the Adams River into a living scarlet ribbon and the shingle bars into theaters of sound. A fish that hatched here swims roughly 400 kilometers to the Pacific, spends 2 to 3 years in the Gulf of Alaska, then returns guided by olfactory cues measured in parts per billion and a magnetic map memorized as a smolt. The 2010 run exceeded 3 million spawners, and isotope studies show their bodies fertilize riparian forests long after eagles finish. Tourism arrives with cameras, but nutrients sign the checks. A clock powered by muscle. 22. Wildest Lake, Canada's rain gauge pushed to the limit. Muscle yields to sky at Wildest Lake near Callan, where 1997 totals reached about 9,300 millimeters, a number that turns ditches into creeks and rooflines into waterfalls. Orographic lift squeezes Pacific lows as they ram the island's outer wall, stacking day after day of warm rain until even spruce bark sweats. Designers here size culverts like urban canals, because water that cannot pass will move the road instead. This is a ledger where every hour of rain compounds interest, a cloud that behaves like a river. 23. Great Bear estuaries, where salmon feed cedar and cedar feeds salmon. Rivers of sky become rivers of flesh in Great Bear estuaries, where bears drag salmon onto forest floors and bones leak marine nitrogen into soils that later shade fry. Tree cores show enriched delta-15 N signatures for decades after big runs, a chemical memory that makes cedar rings read like fisheries ledgers. When escapement falls, isotope values and growth both dim, linking the economy of boats to the hush of moss. Guardians patrol not just for poachers, but for patterns that speak through wood. The forest eats the sea to feed the sea, a feedback written in rings. If you felt this video was worth the effort, subscribing means we can keep creating more content. 24. Haida Gwaii, a shelf edge that turns waves into warnings. Rings widen into warnings along the Queen Charlotte Fault off Haida Gwaii, where the Pacific Plate slides past the margin and writes earthquakes large enough to redraw beach lines. The 1949 magnitude 8.1 strike slip event and the 2012 magnitude 7.7 rupture rang through evacuation sirens and uplifted mussel beds, while drowned cedar stumps whisper older tsunamis around village sites. Archaeology dates human traces beyond 10,000 years here, evidence that a coastal migration route skirted ice along kelp forests rich as grocery aisles. An archipelago remembers motion better than its visitors, a hinge that tests memory. 25. Wells Gray, lava ceilings carved open by sudden water. Memory of fire lies flat across Wells Gray, where Miocene and Pleistocene basalts spread into tiered sheets, and the Clearwater River later slit them into canyons crowned by falls. Helmken drops 141 meters, building winter ice cones as tall as apartment blocks from spray alone. A frozen volcano powered by air, not magma. Pillow basalts along Moole Creek prove lava met water here, each rounded skin a fossilized hiss. What looks like a calm plateau is simply a roof over thunder, a roof cut to reveal thunder. 26. The Chilcotin basalts, a tableland that ends as a cliffed fjord. Thunder fades west across the Chilcotin, a volcanic field that began in the late Miocene and paved the interior plateau with dark stone, only to meet an abrupt guillotine where the coast mountains drop into inlets like Dean and Burke. Straight ranch roads glide for hours on old flows, and then stop at rims where air becomes depth and rivers fall into salt. The punchline arrived when glaciers overdeepened valleys to below sea level and the Pacific rushed in. Geological setup, glacial timing, marine applause. A table sliced to the edge. 27. Tatshenshini-Alsek, rivers that vote with gravity, not passports. Edges dissolve entirely in the far northwest, where the Tatshenshini rises in Yukon and British Columbia, and braids into the Alsek through ice fields that invent their own weather, then exits through Alaska to the Gulf. In 1993, a proposed copper mine faced a transboundary fight. By 1994, the region became part of a UNESCO World Heritage Complex linking Kluane, Wrangell, and Glacier Bay. Rafters read Nunataks like sailors read swells, and grizzlies patrol gravels that look like fresh-minted coins. The watershed answers only to slope, a route that belongs to downhill. However, these lines and meetings only finish drawing the map if we face the illusions at the edge. Forests that are rainforests and snowfields at once, deltas that build outward and then vanish overnight, hot pools that breathe tidal rhythm, inlets deeper than the peaks above them, and towns you reach only by wake or wing. The last lesson waits where the road ends and the color of water changes with a pinch of rock. A frontier that edits itself while you blink. Part 4. Edges, Illusions, and End of Road. Country. 28. Interior snow forest, a rainforest that keeps winter's ledger. However far from the spray of the Pacific you travel, a strange biome shadows the valleys of the Columbia and Upper Fraser, where western red cedar and hemlock tower above snow that stacks more than 2 meters in hard winters and lingers like a second canopy. Scientists call it the interior temperate rainforest, a paradox that drinks over 1,000 millimeters of moisture each year, yet freezes long enough for crowns to avalanche from their own weight, feeding nursery logs as wide as canoes. Dendrochronologists core trunks older than 8 centuries and find nitrogen signatures that spike after strong salmon returns. Proof that ocean nutrients ride inland on eagle wings and wolf trails to fertilize trees that will later shade fry. Sawmills once surged on this timber wealth, then faltered when beetle blooms and market swings exposed the fragility of assumptions mapped in board feet. Avalanche paths cut silver scars through the dark, and skiers read them like calendars that count storms instead of days. Even in July, the forest smells of mushrooms and wet stone, a library shelved by slope and meltwater rather than by season names written on maps. A rainforest that writes in snow. 29. Gulf Islands, Mediterranean pockets braided through a northern sea. Snow yields to salt in the rain shadow sprawled behind Vancouver Island's spine, where the Gulf Islands nurture arbutus with bark that peels like sunburn, and Gary oaks that anchor meadows stitched with camas bulbs once tended as gardens by Coast Salish families. Annual precipitation in south-facing pockets sinks below 700 millimeters, while winter frosts arrive like brief visitors, allowing figs to ripen and experimental olives to test the future of a warming coast. Ferries weave the channels as tidal rips paint quicksilver V's across emerald water, marking herring frenzies that summon sea lions to chorus and bald eagles to carve loops in blue air. Yet ridges hide a harsher arithmetic, because thin soils over sandstone catch little rain, and cisterns become household ledgers as important as mortgages when July stretches dry. Land values climb with sunlight and view cones, transforming microclimate into currency and turning meadows into case studies in stewardship versus subdivision. On summer evenings, the scent of dry thyme drifts from rocky bluffs,
and you could believe yourself somewhere near the Aegean until a kelp raft bumps the shore like a local reminder. Warmth survives by inches. 30. Hot Springs Cove, geothermal breath where surf keeps the beat. Warmth becomes ritual at Hot Springs Cove in the waters of the Nuchanolth Nations, where a fault exhales water near 47 degrees into basalt steps that descend to the Pacific like a staircase of steam. Visitors ride 45 minutes by boat from Tofino or skim in on float planes that set down among whitecaps, then walk a cedar boardwalk engraved with names to pools that refill with heat as the tide slips back and cool as the sea marches in. The schedule feels human, but the engine is tectonic, part of the same subduction story that raised the Garibaldi volcanic belt and left fumaroles breathing under glaciers above Squamish and Pemberton. On fog days, the forest appears and vanishes while ravens debate the etiquette of bathing with strangers, and the air smells of salt and minerals that taste like a lowercase thunder. You sit with strangers and become neighbors because the water insists on sharing, and every wave edits the recipe just enough to keep the lesson sincere. In winter, storms turn the edge faro, and the pools pulse like steady hearts under flying spume. Fire drinks the sea's breath. 31. Over-deepened fjords, where valleys are deeper than the peaks are tall. Breath becomes depth in inlets like Butte, Jervis, and Howe Sound, where glaciers once carved U-shaped canyons so fiercely that many basins now lie far below present sea level, while walls above barely clear 1,000 meters. This is over-deepening, a glacial habit of scouring hardest near the center of flow, until bedrock troughs plunge hundreds of meters, later flooded by a sea that followed the retreating ice with patient inevitability. Sills at the mouths of these fjords throttle tides into standing waves and turn quiet water into engines that oxygenate deep layers only during rare mixing events, a physics that decides where prawns thrive and where hypoxia lurks. Chart soundings read like cliff notes flipped upside down, -600 near mid-channel, then a shallow lip that hoards internal tides like a miser. Float planes thread the skylight while tug crews memorize flak windows the way surgeons memorize anatomy, because currents here punish sloppy timing with hydraulic certainty. Snow avalanches write white commas down black walls every March, and by June the punctuation melts back into sentences of moss. The ocean keeps its archives underfoot. 32. Peace River, a stubborn river that cuts the Rockies instead of detouring. Archives of force surface on the northeastern edge, where the Peace River violates expectation by slicing east through the Rockies rather than skirting their ramparts. A superposed course established when younger uplift rose around an older river like masonry built after a street. The valley opens a green corridor through otherwise stern country, and its silt belts support farms whose yields speak in bushels, while the river itself speaks in megawatts at dams whose politics divide kitchen tables from Fort St. John to Hudson's Hope. Even with concrete stepped into its flow, the Peace still answers to snowpack and thunderstorm lines, rising with prairie heat waves and falling with early frost, proving that management is only a dialect, not a mother tongue. Outcrops along the banks read like a layered memoir of inland seas and ancient swamps, a fossil ledger that ties today's grain bins and gas plants to vanished shorelines. Moose tracks cross fresh silt bars at dawn, and clouds boil up the trench the way breath fogs cold glass. A river that argues with mountains. 33. Three-step cross-section, BC as a staircase from surf to sky. Arguments resolve into architecture when you slice British Columbia west to east and find three grand steps: the coast mountains, the interior plateau, and the Rockies. A staircase built from terrains welded to the continent over hundreds of millions of years. The first rise catches Pacific storms and wrings them into rivers that race down to estuaries, where cranes and salmon share corridors of steel and flesh. The second step stretches as lava-gloss tablelands fretted by canyons, where towns depend on a single mill or a single festival to hold the year together, their calendars braided with freet schedules and fire seasons. The third step lifts into limestone and quartzite, where the continental divide writes the final punctuation for water, wildlife, and weather, sending raindrops to separate oceans and mule deer into separate migrations. Economies stack on this staircase like cargo, from ports and film crews to orchards and mines, to rails that must climb a grade the way hope climbs a winter dawn. Every crisis and boom is just the same staircase lit from a different angle. Relief creates story. 34. Fraser Delta illusions, land that advances, retreats, and impersonates certainty. Story pretends to be certainty where the Fraser River meets the Salish Sea and builds a delta that looks like land but behaves like a tide written in mud. Each freshet carries millions of tons of silt from the interior, stacking new ground under Richmond and Delta, while dredges keep shipping lanes honest and storms claw beaches back into open water. Subdivisions rise on historical marsh and call it neighborhood, then quietly memorize flood routes and sandbag drills, because insurance tables remember what brochures forget. Cranberry bogs glow crimson in October, as if announcing that agriculture here floats on negotiated terms. And dike maps fold like origami, because every line must bend with future water. Geologists measure the delta subsidence in millimeters per year, while planners count sea level rise in centimeters per decade, and the arithmetic meets at storm surge height. Airplanes lift from Sea Island, and for a breath you can see the river's handwriting in pale braids and dark channels that rearrange themselves across years, not centuries. The land rehearses retreat nightly. 35. No road towns, where schedules follow tides and weather, not clocks. Retreat leaves pockets that never invited pavement in the first place. Northern coastal communities you reach only by boat or float plane, where a supermarket pallet depends on a calm window and a clinic visit on cloud ceiling. Outports file their calendars by tide tables and charter availability. Weddings wait for high water and school teams for a light wind. Jobs stack in threes, harvesting, guiding, maintaining, because redundancy is not luxury but survival, and a broken starter can strand the weak. Elders track storms by smell and line on the horizon, then call neighbors when the sky turns the wrong green. Cellular bars matter less than the VHF channel a kid first learns by heart. Freight is measured in liters of fuel and loaves of bread, and social capital spends like currency when you need a part flown in on a seat-removed Cessna. In a century obsessed with speed, these towns read like future manuscripts, not relics, because resilience always begins where roads end. The timetable answers to weather. 36. Glacier Flower Lakes, electric turquoise written by ground stone. Weather returns to color in lakes that look electrified, where a spoonful of water glows blue-green, because rock dust milled by glaciers hangs in suspension and scatters sunlight toward the short wavelengths our eyes chase. Moraine-dammed bulls from the coast mountains to the Rockies share this signature when meltwater feeds them furiously, and the hue shifts with season as inflow slackens and particles settle. Photographers arrive with tripods at dawn and capture a postcard that hides a clock, because the color is strongest when the ice is working hardest upstream. Paddlers learn that beauty has texture when the silt grinds under the hull like silk with teeth, and anglers learn which coves clear enough for trout to hunt by sight. Places famous for this light draw crowds, but quiet coves without names catch the same spell and hold it like a secret for anyone who bothers to walk a little farther. Stone becomes light, then memory. However, these 9 edges do not tie a ribbon around British Columbia so much as reveal the threads out of which the whole coast is woven, from salmon that feed cedars to fjords deeper than mountains are tall, from hot springs that breathe with the surf to a delta that impersonates certainty and then shrugs. What remains after the tours and the maps is a province that behaves like a verb, always carving, drifting, mending, and rehearsing for the next storm. The lesson, as ever, is that land is not background. It is the main character, and it keeps its own time, even when our clocks disagree. A frontier that edits itself.